The auctioneer's gavel came down hard. $12, and just like that, I owned a hole in the ground in the middle of Montana. I was 17 years old. I had $87 left in my pocket, a rusted pickup truck that used to belong to my father and nowhere else to go. The men standing around me at that county surplus auction laughed. One of them, a thick-necked farmer with mud caked on his boots and suspenders stretched tight across his barrel chest, shook his head and muttered something to his friend. Kid bought a hole. I heard him. I pretended I didn't. The June sun beat down on the gravel lot behind the county courthouse, and I could feel sweat trickling down my spine beneath my faded flannel shirt. The air smelled like dust and diesel and something else, something green and alive that I couldn't quite name. The kind of smell that makes you think maybe the world isn't entirely dead, even when everything inside you feels like it is. The county clerk handed me a deed and a tax statement. The paper felt thin in my hands, almost weightless, like it might blow away if I breathed too hard. But it was mine. For the first time in my life, something was legally, officially mine. My name printed in black ink on a document that said I owned something in this world. Jesselyn Whitmore. Most people called me Jess when they called me anything at all. I folded the deed carefully and slipped it into the back pocket of my jeans. The paper crinkled against the worn denim, and I thought about how strange it was that your whole future could fit in your back pocket, that everything you had and everything you hoped for could be reduced to a single sheet of paper that weighed almost nothing at all. 3 days before I bought that hole in the ground, I had been living in a house with a mother who wouldn't look at me and a stepfather who looked at me too much. Not in that way, not the way you might be thinking. Virgil Tatum looked at me like I was a problem, an inconvenience, a leftover piece of furniture from a life my mother was trying to forget. He had these pale blue eyes that never seemed to blink, and when they landed on you, you felt like something being measured for disposal, like he was calculating exactly how much space you took up and whether that space could be put to better use. I remember the morning it happened. June's happened. Hot already even at 7 in the morning, the kind of heat that settles into your bones before you've even finished your first cup of coffee. The kitchen smelled like burnt toast and eggs and the particular staleness of a house where nobody talks anymore. My mother stood at the stove with her back to me. Coraline. That was her name, though I hadn't thought of her as anything but my mother in years. She was stirring something she wasn't going to eat. She never ate breakfast anymore. She just made it for Virgil and stood there watching him consume it, like feeding him was some kind of penance she had to pay every morning for sins she never talked about. Virgil sat at the kitchen table reading the newspaper. He didn't look up when I walked in. He never looked up when I walked in. I was furniture. I was wallpaper. I was something that existed in his peripheral vision, but never warranted direct attention. I poured myself a glass of water from the tap and stood by the counter waiting for something I didn't have a name for. Acknowledgement maybe. Some sign that I existed in this house that used to be mine. Some indication that 17 years of memories meant something to someone other than me. My mother turned from the stove. Her eyes met mine for half a second, then slid away. Quick. Painful. Like I was too bright to look at. Like looking at me hurt her in some way she couldn't explain. You graduated. Virgil's voice cut through the morning silence. He still wasn't looking at me. His eyes stayed fixed on the newspaper on stock prices or sports scores or whatever it was that mattered more than the girl standing in his kitchen. 2 months ago, I said, yes. He folded the newspaper with a crisp, deliberate motion. The sound was sharp in the quiet kitchen, like something breaking. He set it on the table and aligned the edges with the kind of precision that made you understand this was a man who believed in order, in things being where they belonged. Then he looked at me. For the first time that morning, his pale eyes found my face, and they were flat, empty, like he was looking at a chair he was thinking about throwing away, like he had already made the calculation and I had come up short. You're an adult now, he said. His voice was matter-of-fact, almost pleasant, the way you might tell someone the weather forecast or the time. 18 in 3 months. Close enough. Time to figure things out on your own. My mother's hand tightened on the spatula. I could see her knuckles going white against the black handle. I could see the tension in her shoulders, the slight tremor in her spine. She knew what was coming. Maybe she had known for weeks. Maybe she had been dreading this moment and hoping for it at the same time the way you dread pulling off a bandage but know the wound needs air to heal. I waited for her to say something, to argue, to tell him that this was my home, that I had grown up in these rooms, that my father had carried me on his shoulders through that front door when I was 3 years old, that my height was still marked on the kitchen door frame in pencil, a record of every birthday from age 5 to 12 before marking my growth stopped being something anyone celebrated. She didn't say anything, she just kept stirring. The eggs were already overcooked. I could smell them turning rubbery in the pan. But she kept stirring anyway, like maybe if she stirred long enough, she wouldn't have to turn around. Wouldn't have to watch her daughter be thrown away like yesterday's newspaper. The silence stretched between us like a wire pulled too tight. I could hear the eggs sizzling in the pan. I could hear the clock on the wall ticking away, seconds that felt like hours. I could hear my own heartbeat steady and slow, even though everything inside me was screaming. Even though every cell in my body was telling me to fight, to argue, to make her see me. But I had learned something in the 2 years since Virgil Tatum moved into our house. I had learned that some battles you cannot win. I had learned that some people make up their minds about you before you ever open your mouth, and nothing you say will change what they've already decided. I set down my glass of water. Okay, I said. That was all. Just that one word. Okay, my mother's stirring stopped, just for a moment. Just long enough for me to know she heard. Then it started again, and I turned and walked out of the kitchen, and I didn't look back. I packed in under an hour. 1 backpack, 2 duffel bags, everything I owned in the world fit into a space smaller than a grocery cart. I had $87 in my checking account, money I'd saved from babysitting jobs and weekend shifts at the diner downtown. I had my father's truck, a 1972 Ford F-100 with a cracked windshield and an engine that coughed like an old man with a cold. I had no job lined up, no apartment waiting, no one expecting me anywhere. My mother stood in the doorway of my bedroom while I packed. She didn't help. She didn't offer to help. She just stood there with her arms crossed over her chest, watching me fold my clothes into tight, efficient squares. The way my father had taught me to fold them back when he was still alive, and teaching me things mattered. The room looked different with my things being removed from it, smaller, emptier. The walls were the same pale blue they'd been since I was 8 years old when my father had let me pick the color. I remembered him standing on a ladder roller in hand, asking me if I was sure I wanted blue. Blue like the sky, I had told him. So I can fly even when I'm inside. He had laughed at that, a real laugh, deep and warm and full of something that I later learned to call love. And he had painted the whole room that afternoon, even the ceiling, because he said if I was going to fly, I might as well have sky in every direction. Now the blue looked faded, tired, like it had given up too, Jess. My mother's voice was thin, uncertain, the voice of someone who knows they should speak but doesn't know what to say. I didn't answer. Jess, please. I zipped the second duffel bag and straightened up, looked at her, really looked for the first time in months. She was 42 years old, but she looked older, tired, the kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix, the kind that settles into your bones and never leaves. He's not a bad man, she said. Her voice cracked on the words. He just needs things to be simple. And I'm not simple. It wasn't a question. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. That was the thing about my mother. She had learned somewhere along the way to keep everything inside, to swallow her feelings until they dissolved into nothing, to be exactly what people needed her to be, and never anything more. I'm sorry, she whispered. I picked up my bags. No, I said, you're not. And I walked out the front door of the house where I had grown up. The house where my father had taught me to ride a bike in the driveway. The house where I had measured my height against the kitchen door frame every birthday until I turned 12. The house that smelled like coffee in the mornings and like my father's aftershave in the evenings, back when there were still evenings worth remembering. I didn't look back. If I had looked back, I might have seen her standing at the window. I might have seen her hand pressed against the glass. I might have seen her crying the tears she wouldn't let me see. But I didn't look back, and so I never knew. The first night I slept in my truck in a Walmart parking lot. I parked in the far corner, away from the lights and the security cameras and the occasional shopping cart rattling past. I reclined the seat as far as it would go and pulled a blanket over my head and told myself that this was temporary, that tomorrow I would find a job, that next week I would have an apartment, that next month everything would be fine. The lies we tell ourselves are the kindest lies of all. I woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of a shopping cart rattling past my window. An old man was pushing it bent and slow, his cart filled with the aluminum cans that clinked against each other with every step. He didn't see me, or maybe he did and just didn't care. People who live on the margins learn not to see each other. It's easier that way. I watched him disappear into the darkness, this bent figure with his cart full of other people's garbage. And I wondered if that would be me someday. Pushing a cart through empty parking lots at 3 in the morning, invisible to everyone, forgotten by the world. The second night was worse. A security guard knocked on my window at 2 in the morning and his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness like a blade. It illuminated the pile of clothes I was using as a pillow, the empty water bottles on the floor, the girl who was trying very hard to look like she had somewhere to be. "You can't stay here," he said, not unkindly but firmly. The voice of someone who had said these words before, who would say them again. "There's a shelter downtown if you need it." I didn't go to the shelter. I had heard stories about shelters, about the things that happened in crowded rooms where desperate people gathered, about the belongings that went missing and the questions that got asked in the way they looked at you like you were something broken that needed fixing. I found a spot behind an abandoned church on the edge of town instead. The parking lot was cracked and overgrown with weeds, and the church itself had been closed for years. Its windows were boarded up with plywood that had turned gray with weather. Its steeple listed slightly to the left like a drunk trying to keep his balance. No one came there, no one saw me. I pulled the blanket over my head and listened to the crickets singing in the darkness. And I told myself that this was temporary, that I would figure something out. The third night it rained. The truck's roof had a leak I hadn't known about. Water dripped onto my face, cold and insistent, until I gave up on sleep entirely and just sat there in the darkness, watching the rain streak down the windshield like tears. I thought about my father. I thought about the way he used to sing in the shower off key and too loud. Songs from the 70s that my mother pretended to hate but secretly loved. I thought about the way he would come home from work with grease on his hands and swing me up onto his shoulders and carry me around the yard while I pretended I was flying. I thought about the last time I saw him, the morning of the accident. He had been running late, rushing out the door with his coffee in one hand and his keys in the other. He had kissed me on the forehead, quick and warm, and said the words I would replay in my mind every day for the next 5 years. "See you tonight, Ladybug." But there was no tonight. There was only the icy road and the truck that crossed the center line and the phone call that changed everything. There was only my mother screaming and the funeral where everyone wore black and the way the house felt different afterward, like something essential had been removed and the walls didn't know how to stand without it. Sitting in my truck with the rain dripping on my face, I didn't cry. I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But something in me had gone hard and still like a sweeting freezing over in winter. The tears were there somewhere underneath, but I couldn't reach them. Maybe that was a good thing. Maybe crying would have broken something in me that I couldn't afford to break. The next morning, I walked into a gas station bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror. The girl staring back at me had dark circles under her eyes and hair that hadn't been properly washed in days. She looked like someone who had lost something important, like someone who was barely holding on. You look like hell, I told my reflection. My reflection didn't argue. I splashed water on my face and pulled my hair back into a ponytail and made myself look like someone who had a place to go, a life to live. Then I walked out of the gas station and started down Main Street, not sure where I was going, just walking, moving, because standing still felt too much like giving up. That's when I saw the flyer. It was taped to the window of the feed store, crooked and water-stained from the previous night's rain. The paper had started to curl at the edges, and the ink had bled slightly, making the words look like they were melting. County surplus auction, it said. Saturday, 9 a.m., unclaimed agricultural structures. I didn't know what unclaimed agricultural structures meant, but I knew what auctions meant. Auctions meant cheap, and cheap was all I could afford. The auction was held in a gravel lot behind the county courthouse. There were maybe 30 people there when I arrived, most of them men with weathered faces and calloused hands. Farmers by the look of them. Ranchers. Men who worked the land and knew its secrets. They stood in small clusters, talking in low voices, occasionally glancing toward the wooden platform where the auctioneer was setting up his equipment. I stood at the back of the crowd trying to look like I belonged. I didn't belong. I was 17 years old and homeless and had $87 to my name. I was wearing the same clothes I had worn for 3 days straight. I was surrounded by men who had probably owned more land than I would ever see, who had inherited farms from their fathers and their fathers before them, who knew things about soil and seasons that I couldn't even imagine. But I was there, and that had to count for something. The auctioneer was a thin man with a voice like gravel grinding against itself. He moved through the items quickly, his words running together in that practice patter that auctioneers develop over years of repetition. His hands moved constantly, pointing, gesturing, marking the rhythm of commerce. A rusted hay baler went for $15. Broken fencing panels for $8. Old water troughs with holes in the bottom went for $3 each. Everything went fast, bought by the farmers or the scrap metal dealers for prices that wouldn't buy a decent meal. Near the end of the auction, the auctioneer cleared his throat. He shuffled the papers on his podium, and something in his expression changed. A slight lift at the corner of his mouth. The look of a man about to tell a joke. Item 17, he announced. Collapsed root cellar, parcel 14C, minimum bid $9. A few people chuckled. That's sinkhole behind the old Harris place, someone said. The voice came from my left, and I turned to look at the speaker. Emmett Sutner. I didn't know his name then. I just saw a man of 63 years with a face like weathered leather and eyes that had seen too much disappointment to expect anything else. He wore overalls that had been patched more times than I could count, and his hands were thick and calloused from decades of working the land. There was something heavy about him, something that went deeper than his broad shoulders and solid frame. A weight he carried that had nothing to do with physical burden. The auctioneer nodded. It's technically classified as a failed agricultural storage structure. More laughter from the crowd. The scrap metal dealers shook their heads. The farmers exchanged amused glances. Nobody raised their hand. Nobody wanted to pay $9 for a hole in the ground. The auctioneer looked around, his gavel raised. Going once at 9. Anyone $9 for parcel 14C. Silence. Going twice. I thought about my father. I thought about the way he used to say that opportunity doesn't always look like opportunity. Sometimes it looks like work. Sometimes it looks like something everyone else has already passed by. Sometimes it looks like a hole in the ground that nobody wants. $12. The words came out of my mouth before I could stop them. My voice sounded strange in my own ears. Thin, young, but clear. Clear enough to cut through the morning air and turn every head in my direction. Emmett Sutner stared at me. His eyebrows drew together like he was trying to figure out what kind of creature I was. What species? What planet I had come from, where it made sense for a teenage girl to buy a collapsed root cellar for $12. The auctioneer blinked. Do I hear 12? He looked around the crowd, waiting for someone else to bid, waiting for sanity to prevail. No one spoke. The gavel came down. Sold, the auctioneer said to the young lady in the back. Emmett Sutner shook his head slowly. He turned to the man next to him, and I watched his lips move. I couldn't hear the words over the rustle of the crowd, over the sound of my own heart pounding in my chest. But I saw what he said. Kid bought a hole. She's going to bury herself in it. His hand trembled when he said it, just slightly, just enough that I noticed. And something in his voice, something I couldn't quite identify, made me think he wasn't just talking about me. Made me think he was talking about someone else. Someone he had lost. Someone who had buried themselves in something they couldn't escape. I walked up to the clerk's table and signed my name on the deed. My hand was steady. My heart was not. The property sat half a mile off a gravel road past a sagging fence line in a field that had surrendered to weeds years ago. I drove out there that same afternoon, my truck bouncing over ruts and rocks that seemed designed to test the limits of its ancient suspension. The sun was high and hot, beating down through the cracked windshield with an intensity that made me squint. The air smelled like dust and dry grass and something else, something green and alive underneath the brown. I rolled down the window and let the wind tangle my hair. And for a moment, just a moment, I felt something that might have been hope. A small flame flickering in my chest, the sense that maybe, just maybe, I was driving towards something instead of away from it. Then I saw the property, or rather, I saw nothing. No house, no barn, no structure of any kind. Just a shallow depression in the earth, a dip, where the soil had sunk inward like a held breath. Grass grew unevenly across the top, wild and unkempt, trying to hide the wound beneath. Wildflowers dotted the edges, purple and yellow and white, growing without anyone's permission. I parked the truck and got out. The silence was immediate and absolute. No traffic sounds, no voices, no airplanes overhead. Just the whisper of wind through the grass and the distant call of a hawk circling somewhere to the north. I walked to the edge of the depression and stood there for a long moment, looking down at what I had bought. Everyone at that auction had seen a hole, a mistake, a joke. They had seen a 17-year-old girl throwing away $12 on something worthless. They had seen failure before it even began. But I saw something different. The original cellar had been stone-lined. I could see sections of it now emerging from the collapsed soil like bones breaking through skin. Hand-laid field stone forming what had once been a curved arch entrance. The stones were gray and brown and speckled with lichen, fitted together with the kind of precision that spoke of skill and patience and time. The wooden hatch doors that had once covered the entrance had rotted through decades ago. They lay in fragments around the opening, dark with moisture and soft with decay. But the stone was still there, still solid, still holding on to the shape someone had given it more than a century ago. I climbed down carefully. The entrance was half blocked by fallen timbers and dirt, but I found a path through. The smell hit me first, cool and earthy like the inside of a cave, like something old and permanent and untouched by the chaos above ground. The stone walls were still intact. No major cracks, no full structural collapse, just a failure point at the top where the old timber roof beams had rotted through over the decades until the soil above simply pushed through. A wound, but not a fatal one. I pressed my hand against the stone. Cool, solid, old. The walls were thick, at least 18 inches of fieldstone stacked with lime mortar that had held for nearly 100 years. I ran my fingers along the joints, feeling the texture of work done by hands that had turned to dust long before I was born. The chamber was deeper than I expected, nearly 8 feet at its lowest point. The original space was roughly 12 by 14 feet, with a barrel-vaulted ceiling design that had been wood-framed rather than stone. The wood was gone, now collapsed into the dirt above, but the sidewalls still curved inward at the top, still remembered the shape they had been meant to hold. I stood in that dim, cool space surrounded by walls that someone had built with their own hands in 1892, and I felt something shift inside me. Something I hadn't felt since the morning my mother let me walk away. Something I hadn't felt since the night my father didn't come home. Something that had been frozen solid in my chest for so long, I had forgotten it existed. Hope. Everyone else saw a hole. I saw square footage. I saw potential. I saw home. That night I sat in my truck with a notebook balanced on my knee and sketched by the dim glow of the dome light. I had read books about underground construction. Not because I ever planned to build anything underground, but because I read everything. Books were free at the library, and during the long afternoons when my mother was at work and I didn't want to be in the house with Virgil, I would walk to the public library and disappear into the stacks. I read about history and science and architecture and engineering. I read about how things were built and why they fell apart. I read about the mistakes people made and the solutions they found. I read about everything because knowledge was the one thing nobody could take away from me. Underground structures don't fight the earth. I remembered reading once, they cooperate with the soil. The temperature below ground fluctuates far less than above ground. In winter, the earth retains warmth. In summer, it stays cool. The key isn't fighting nature. The key is working with it. I sketched a plan. Room 1, main living space. Built within the original stone footprint, 12 by 14 feet. Enough room for a bed, a table, a small cooking area. Enough room for one person to live. Room 2, storage and mechanical space. Dug laterally into the hillside. A place for supplies, for tools, for the equipment I would need to survive. Room 3, secondary sleeping area. Further back where the earth was thickest and the temperature most stable. A refuge within a refuge. Reinforced with treated lumber framing. Overhead beams rated for soil load. A drainage system around the perimeter to prevent water infiltration. Ventilation shafts to manage airflow. It wouldn't be a bunker in the dramatic sense. It wouldn't be a fortress or a compound or any of the things people imagine when they think about living underground. It would be engineered. It would be practical. It would be mine. The next morning, I drove back to the property with my sleeves rolled up and a plan in my head. I didn't have money for equipment. I had a shovel that I'd bought at a yard sale for $2, the blade slightly bent but still functional. I had a pry bar I'd found in the bed of my father's truck, rusted but solid, and I had a wheelbarrow I'd borrowed from the salvage yard owner in town, a gruff man named Bert who had looked at me like I was crazy, but handed it over anyway. "Don't break it," he had said. "I won't," he had grunted. "Probably will anyway. That's fine, just bring back the pieces." I started with the debris. The fallen timbers came out first, one at a time. They were heavier than they looked, waterlogged and half-rotted, and by the end of the first hour, my arms were shaking with the effort. But I kept going. Every shovel of dirt told a story. Layers of soil that had compressed over decades of weather. Fragments of old wood remnants of the original construction. A rusted nail here, a shard of broken pottery there. Evidence of the people who had come before me, who had built this space with their own hands and then, for whatever reason, left it behind. I wondered about them sometimes. The Harris family, what had happened to them, why they had abandoned this place, whether they had ever stood where I was standing and felt the same mix of fear and hope and determination. I worked until my hands blistered. Then I wrapped them in strips of fabric torn from an old t-shirt and kept working. The blisters broke and bled, and I kept working. The blood dried and my skin cracked, and I kept working. By the end of the first week, I had cleared enough soil to see the inner structure clearly. The foundation was solid. The walls were sound, and the idea that had been forming in my mind since that first day became something more than an idea. It became a plan. I was hauling a wheelbarrow full of dirt out of the depression when I heard the truck. It pulled up behind my pickup, newer than mine, a Ford with mud splattered up the sides. A man got out, tall, weathered, familiar. Emmett Sutner. I recognized him from the auction. That face like leather left too long in the sun. Those eyes that expected disappointment and found it everywhere they looked. He walked toward me slowly, carefully, like he was approaching a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. His boots crunched on the gravel and the dry grass, marking his progress across the empty land. I set down the wheelbarrow and waited. He stopped a few feet away, looked at me, looked at the hole, looked at me again. "You bearing something?" His voice was flat, neither friendly nor hostile. Just a question. "Building something," I answered. He stared at me for a long moment. Something flickered in his eyes. Something that looked almost like recognition. Like he was seeing someone else standing in my place. Someone he remembered. Someone he had lost. Then the moment passed. He shook his head, turned around, and walked back toward his truck. His shoulders were hunched like a man carrying weight that had nothing to do with physical burden. "Going to end up burying yourself," he said over his shoulder. "That hole's going to collapse and they're going to find you in the spring when the snow melts." He drove away. I picked up the wheelbarrow and went back to work. 2 weeks later, the blisters on my hands had turned to calluses. The ache in my back had become a constant companion, and the hole in the ground had started to look like something else entirely. I had cleared all the debris. I had shored up the walls with temporary supports made from lumber I'd scavenged from an abandoned barn 3 miles down the road. I had begun excavating downward, creating the foundation for a proper concrete floor. The work was brutal. I won't pretend it wasn't. 12 hours a day, sometimes 14. Digging, hauling, measuring, adjusting. My hands bled and healed and bled again until they developed calluses thick as leather. My shoulders burned with the effort of lifting. Lifting, always carrying. But slowly, inch by inch, the underground space began to take shape. I was sitting on the edge of the excavation one evening, eating a can of cold beans and watching the sun set over the hills, when I heard footsteps approaching through the grass. Soft footsteps. Careful. Not the heavy tread of Emmett Sutner coming to predict my failure. I turned and saw a woman standing at the edge of my property. She was small, maybe 5'2", with silver hair that caught the last light of the dying sun. She wore a simple cotton dress and sensible shoes, and she carried a casserole dish covered with aluminum foil. Her face was lined with age and something else. Something gentler than age. Something that looked almost like hope. "Hello," she called out. "Is someone down there?" I climbed up out of the excavation, dirt-covered and sweat-stained, and probably looking like something that had crawled out of the earth rather than something that was trying to build in it. She didn't flinch, didn't step back, just looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You're the girl who bought the Harris cellar," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She held out the casserole dish. Steam was still rising from beneath the foil. The smell of it, rich and savory and warm, made my stomach clench with sudden desperate hunger. "I brought you dinner," she said. "You look like you could use a proper meal." I hesitated. In my experience, kindness always came with strings attached. People didn't give you things without wanting something in return. People didn't show up with casserole dishes and gentle smiles unless they were looking for something. But her eyes were warm, and the casserole smelled like heaven, and I hadn't eaten anything hot in days. "Thank you," I said, and I meant it. She smiled, a real smile, one that reached her eyes and softened the lines around them. Then her expression shifted, becoming more serious. "Don't tell my husband I was here," she said. "Emmett has strong opinions about things he doesn't understand." "Emmett," the name clicked into place. "Your husband is the man who asked if I was burying something." "Yes," she sighed, and the sound was heavy with years of accumulated understanding. "He's not a bad man, just stubborn. And scared, though he'd never admit it." "Scared of what?" She was quiet for a moment. The sun had almost completely set now, and her face was lit by the last red glow of twilight. In that light, she looked younger somehow, or maybe just less tired. Of change, she said finally. Of young people who do things differently than he did. Of losing what he has left. She paused, looked at me with those gentle, knowing eyes. You remind me of my daughter. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning I didn't yet understand. She passed when she was young, the woman continued. Her voice was soft now, almost a whisper. 16 years old. Car accident just like that. She was full of fire, that girl, full of plans and dreams and certainty that she could do anything she set her mind to. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. Emmett has never been the same since we lost her, she went on. He looks at young people now, and all he can see is what he lost. All he can feel is the fear of losing again. So he tells himself that good things won't happen, that young people will fail, that dreams are foolish, because if he doesn't hope, he can't be hurt again. She reached out and touched my arm. Her fingers were light and warm, and I felt something in my chest loosen just slightly. But you're proving him wrong, she said. Every day you work on this place, every wall, you reinforce every beam you set, you're showing him that hope isn't always foolish, that sometimes the impossible things actually happen. I looked at her, this small woman with silver hair and gentle eyes, this woman who had lost a daughter and still found it in herself to bring casserole to a stranger. What's your name, I asked. Odalis, she said. Odalis Sutner. I'm Jess, she smiled again. I know. The whole county knows. The girl who bought a hole for $12, she patted my arm. Some of them are laughing, but some of them are watching, wondering what you're going to build. She turned to go walking back across the grass toward wherever she had parked. The darkness was falling fast now, and her silver hair caught the first pale light of the rising moon. Mrs. Sutner, I called after her. She stopped, turned. Thank you, I said. Not just for the food, for telling me about your daughter, for understanding. She nodded slowly. Something glistened in her eyes, but she blinked it away before it could fall. Build something beautiful, she said. Show them all what a whole can become. Then she was gone, disappearing into the darkness like a ghost. I ate the casserole that night sitting on the tailgate of my truck, looking up at the stars. It was the best thing I had tasted in weeks, maybe the best thing I had ever tasted, not because of the ingredients or the preparation, but because of what it represented. Someone had thought about me. Someone had taken time out of their day to make something for me. Someone had looked at the dirty, tired girl digging in the ground and seen something worth feeding. I thought about Odalis Sutner's daughter, 16 years old, full of fire, gone in an instant. I thought about my father, running late that morning, coffee in one hand, keys in the other. See you tonight, Ladybug. I thought about all the people who had died too young, too suddenly, too unfairly, all the potential that had been erased, all the dreams that had been cut short. And I made a decision. I was going to build something, something that would last, something that would matter, something that would prove that a hole in the ground could become a home, that a girl with nothing could create something, that hope wasn't foolish, even when the world tried its best to convince you otherwise. I scraped the last of the casserole from the bishouet and set it aside to return tomorrow. Then I climbed down into the excavation with a flashlight and got back to work. The night was cool and quiet around me. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to my struggles, indifferent to my dreams. But I didn't need them to care. I just needed them to watch. By the end of the month, the first phase was complete. I had installed temporary vertical support posts made from reclaimed 4x4 treated lumber, positioning them beneath the remaining edges of the original roof to prevent any further collapse. I had excavated an additional 2 feet downward, creating space for a proper concrete slab. I had leveled the floor with nothing but a cheap level from the hardware store and my own stubborn determination. The slab wasn't pretty when I poured it. Concrete work is hard, especially when you're mixing it by hand in small batches because you can't afford a mixer. But it was level, and level matters more than smooth. Once the slab cured, I began framing the new roof structure. Pressure-treated beams laid horizontally across the stone walls. Support posts every 16 inches, plywood sheathing above that, then a heavy-duty waterproof membrane, then gravel for drainage, then soil backfill, layered deliberately one wheelbarrow at a time. The day I finished burying that reinforced roof, I climbed back up to ground level and stood there looking at what I had created. From the outside, it looked like a grassy mound, no different from a dozen others scattered across the Montana landscape. A gentle rise in the earth covered with wild grass and wildflowers. Nothing to indicate what lay beneath, but I knew, and that was enough. Odalis came by 3 more times over the following weeks. Each visit, she brought something different. A jar of homemade jam made from berries she had picked herself, a loaf of bread still warm from the oven wrapped in a clean cloth, a worn blanket that she said she didn't need anymore, but that I could tell had been carefully washed and mended before she brought it. She never stayed long, just long enough to see that I was still there, still working, still alive. She would stand at the edge of the excavation and watch me for a few minutes, her silver hair catching the light, her eyes soft with something that might have been concern, or might have been admiration, or might have been both. One afternoon, she stayed longer than usual. I had just finished installing the first ventilation shaft, a PVC pipe that rose from the main chamber to the surface, angled to prevent rain from entering. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. "You're doing something remarkable here," O'Dali said quietly. She was sitting on a large rock near the entrance, watching me seal the joint with waterproof caulk. I shrugged. "I'm just trying to build something." "No." She shook her head slowly. "You're trying to survive. There's a difference. Plenty of people try to survive. They find jobs and apartments and they get by. But you're not just trying to get by. You're trying to create something that will last, something permanent, something that can't be taken away." I set down the caulk gun and looked at her. "Why do you come here?" I asked. "Why do you help me?" She was quiet for a long moment. The wind whispered through the grass around us, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk called out sharp and lonely. "Because you remind me of what she could have been," O'Dali said finally. "My daughter." She had that same fire in her eyes. That same certainty that she could build something beautiful even when the world told her she couldn't. She paused. "She never got the chance to build it, but you do." I felt my throat tighten, felt something hot and painful pressing against the backs of my eyes. "What was her name?" I asked. She smiled, and it was the saddest smile I had ever seen. "Rosemary," she said. "We called her Rosie. Tell me about her." And she did. For the next hour, Odalis sat on that rock and told me about her daughter, about the way Rosie used to laugh loud and bright and completely unafraid, about the poems she wrote and the songs she sang and the plans she had made for a future she would never see, about the morning of the accident when she had left for school with a wave and a smile and a promise to be home for dinner. She told me about the phone call that changed everything, about the hospital where they couldn't save her, about the funeral where the whole town came to mourn a girl who had been loved by everyone who knew her. And she told me about Emmett, about the way he had closed himself off after they lost Rosie, the way he had stopped laughing, stopped hoping, stopped believing that anything good could ever happen again. The way he looked at young people now with fear instead of joy, because every young person reminded him of what he had lost. He wasn't always like this, Odalis said. Her voice was heavy with grief and love, and the weight of years spent loving someone who couldn't let himself be loved in return. He used to be the first one to help when someone needed it, the first one to believe in people, the first one to say that anything was possible. She looked at me with those gentle, knowing eyes. "You're showing him what's possible," she said. "Every day you come out here and works on this place, you're showing him that hope isn't foolish, that young people can build something, that holes can become foundations." She reached out and took my hand. Her fingers were thin and papery with age, but her grip was strong. "Don't give up," she said. "No matter what he says, no matter what anyone says, build something beautiful. Build something that lasts. Show them all what you're capable of. I squeezed her hand. I will, I said. And I meant it. That night I worked until midnight by the light of a battery-powered lantern. I hung it from the newly installed support beams and let its pale glow illuminate the space I was creating. The walls were solid around me. The floor was firm beneath my feet. The air was cool and still and smelled like earth and stone and possibility. I thought about Rosemary Sutner, 16 years old, full of fire, gone before she could build anything. I thought about my father, full of life, full of love, gone before he could see me grow up. I thought about all the people who never got the chance to finish what they started, all the dreams that ended too soon, all the holes that stayed holes because no one was left to fill them. And I kept working, because that's what you do when you have nothing left. You work, you build, you create something from nothing, one shovel at a time, one stone at a time, one day at a time. You find the foundation buried beneath the rubble, and you start digging. 6 weeks of work had transformed the hole into something else entirely. I stood at the entrance of my underground shelter on a September morning, watching the mist rise from the valley below. The air had that crisp edge that tells you summer is dying, that the world is preparing itself for the long sleep of winter. The grass around my property had turned from green to gold, and the cottonwood trees along the distant creek were just beginning to show their autumn colors. My hands were different now. I held them up in the early light and studied them like they belonged to someone else. The palms were calloused, thick as leather, the skin cracked and weathered in ways that made me look older than 17. These were not the hands of a girl. These were the hands of someone who had built something. The main chamber was complete, 12 by 14 feet of living space carved from the earth and reinforced with pressure-treated lumber. The walls were a combination of the original fieldstone and new framing, covered with plywood panels that I had painted white to reflect the light from the battery-powered lanterns. A small wood stove sat in one corner, its chimney pipe angling up through a reinforced sleeve in the soil above. A sleeping area occupied another corner, just a mattress on a raised platform to keep it off the cold floor, but it was warm and dry in mine. The second chamber was rougher but functional. Storage space for food water tools. Shelves I had built from scrap lumber lined the walls holding canned goods and dried beans and all the supplies I had accumulated over the weeks of construction. A water barrel sat in the corner filled from a spring I had found half a mile up the hillside. The third chamber was still in progress. I had excavated the space and framed the walls, but the finishing work remained. That would come later when I had more time, more resources, more of everything except determination. Determination I had in abundance. The temperature underground held steady at 55 degrees, regardless of what happened above. On hot September afternoons when the sun beat down and the air shimmered with heat, my shelter stayed cool. On cold September nights when frost crept across the grass and my breath made clouds in the air, my shelter stayed warm enough to sleep without shivering. I had done this. I had built this. Me, 17 years old, $87 to my name. Nothing but a hole in the ground and stubborn refusal to accept that I was beaten. The books from the library had taught me about thermal mass, about the way the earth absorbs and releases heat over time. But reading about something and living it are different things. Feeling the cool air on a hot day, feeling the warmth on a cold night, feeling the stability that comes from being surrounded by earth instead of fighting against it, that was something no book could have prepared me for. I had stopped sleeping in my truck weeks ago. Now I slept underground in the space I had carved from the soil. And every night as I lay in my bed listening to the deep silence of the earth, I felt something I hadn't felt since my father died. Safe, the building supply store in town, was called Colton's Hardware, a sprawling wooden structure that had been serving the community for 3 generations. I walked through the front door on a Tuesday afternoon, still wearing my work clothes, dirt under my fingernails and dust in my hair. The bell above the door chimed my arrival, and the smell of sawdust and metal and motor oil wrapped around me like a familiar blanket. I had been here before buying nails and screws and the occasional bag of concrete mix. The owner, a heavy-set man with a gray beard and kind eyes, had never asked what I was building. He just rang up my purchases and nodded when I thanked him. But today, it wasn't the owner behind the counter. It was a young man, maybe 19 or 20, with dark hair that fell into his eyes and hands that were always moving. He was stacking boxes of screws onto a display rack, his movements quick and efficient, and he didn't look up when I walked in. I made my way to the back of the store where the concrete mix was stacked in heavy bags against the wall. I needed 3 bags to finish the floor of the third chamber. 3 bags at roughly $20 each. $60 I didn't have. I had saved everything I could over the past weeks. Odd jobs around town, cleaning houses, mowing lawns, anything that would put a few dollars in my pocket. But the money went fast when you were building something from nothing, and I was always behind. I stood in front of the concrete bags doing the math in my head for the 100th time, counting the bills in my pocket, trying to figure out how to make less equal more. You're building something. The voice came from behind me. I turned and found the young man standing there no longer stacking boxes. His name tag said Shepherd, and his eyes were curious, not mocking. Yes, I said. What kind of something? I hesitated. Most people who asked that question were looking for an excuse to laugh, looking for confirmation that I was as foolish as they suspected. But something in his expression told me he was genuinely interested. An underground structure, I said. Reinforced walls, concrete floor, living space. He didn't laugh. Instead, he tilted his head slightly like he was seeing me in a new light, like I had suddenly become more interesting than the boxes of screws he had been stacking. That's impressive, he said. How long have you been working on it? 6 weeks. By yourself, yes. He was quiet for a moment, processing this information. I could see the wheels turning in his head, the questions forming behind his eyes. But he didn't ask the obvious ones, the ones everyone else asked. He didn't ask why I was building underground or where I got the money or whether I had any idea what I was doing. Instead, he looked at the concrete bags, then back at me. Tell you what he said, we've got some bags in back that got wet on one corner. Still good, just can't sell them full price. I could let them go for 40 if you want. For all 3, I stared at him. Why, I asked. He shrugged. Because you're building something. Because most people just talk about doing things, but you're actually doing them. He paused and something flickered in his eyes, something that looked almost like admiration. And because I've been working in this store since I was 15, and I can tell the difference between someone who's going to give up and someone who isn't. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded. Thank you, I said. And I meant it. His name was Shepard Colton. Shep, he told me as he helped me load the concrete bags into the bed of my truck. Everyone calls me Shep. The store belongs to my uncle. I just work here. I'm Jess. I know. He smiled and it transformed his face from serious to almost boyish. You're the girl who bought the hole for $12. Whole county's been talking about you. What are they saying? Depends on who you ask. Some people think you're crazy. Some people think you're stupid. He paused, lifting the last bag into the truck bed. Some people think you might actually pull this off. Which category do you fall into? He wiped his hands on his jeans and looked at me. His eyes were brown, almost black in the afternoon light, and there was something steady in them. Something reliable. I think he said slowly that anyone who can look at a hole in the ground and see a home is either crazy or a visionary. And I'm not sure there's much difference between the two. I almost smiled. Almost. That's not really an answer. No, he agreed. It's not. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a scrap of paper, scribbled something on it with a pencil stub. Here's my number. If you ever need help hauling materials or building anything, give me a call. I get off work at 6 most days. I took the paper, looked at the numbers written in his careful, precise handwriting. "Why would you help me?" I asked. He shrugged again, but this time there was something more in the gesture. Something that spoke of long hours in a store that wasn't his, of dreams deferred, of life not quite matching expectations. Because building something sounds a lot more interesting than stacking boxes, he said, and because everyone deserves at least one person in their corner. He turned and walked back into the store before I could respond. I drove home with 3 bags of concrete in the back of my truck and a phone number in my pocket. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something other than exhaustion and determination. I felt like maybe I wasn't quite as alone as I thought. Shep came to the property 3 days later. He pulled up in an old pickup truck, the bed loaded with scrap lumber that he said had been destined for the burn pile at a construction site across town. The foreman had let him take it for nothing. He explained as long as he promised not to tell anyone where he got it. "Perfectly good wood," Shep said, hauling a stack of 2x4s out of the truck bed. "Just because it's got a few nail holes doesn't mean it's useless." We worked together that afternoon, framing the walls of the third chamber. He was stronger than he looked, and he knew how to use tools with the kind of efficiency that comes from years of practice. But more than that, he knew when to talk and when to stay quiet, when to ask questions and when to just work. By sunset, we had accomplished more than I could have done alone in 3 days. We sat on the tailgate of my truck afterward, watching the light fade from the sky. The air was cool, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled lonely and wild. "This is really something," Shep said. He was looking at the entrance to the shelter at the stone archway that had stood for over a century at the new work I had built around it. "Most people wouldn't even know what they were looking at." "That's kind of the point," I said. He nodded slowly, understanding, without needing explanation. After that, he came back every few days. Sometimes he brought materials scavenged from job sites and dumpsters, and anywhere else he could find things that people were throwing away. Sometimes he just brought himself, his strong back and willing hands, in the quiet companionship of someone who didn't need to fill every silence with words. We didn't talk much at first, just worked. But slowly over the weeks that followed, the silences became more comfortable. The work became a kind of conversation, a language we both understood. I learned that his parents had died when he was 12. Car accident, same as my father. He had been raised by his uncle, the owner of the hardware store, and had been working there ever since. He had dreams of building things, real things, houses and barns and structures that would outlast him. But dreams required money, and money required time, and time was something that seemed to slip away faster than he could catch it. I learned that he was kind in a quiet, unassuming way, that he noticed things other people missed, that he had a way of looking at problems that saw solutions where others saw only obstacles. And I learned that having someone in your corner, even just one person, made everything feel less impossible. The Mercedes came on a Tuesday. October had settled over the valley like a cold blanket, stripping the last leaves from the trees and painting the mornings with frost. I was underground adjusting the damper on the wood stove when I heard the engine. It was wrong. The sound was too smooth, too expensive, too out of place on the gravel road that led to my property. I climbed up to the surface and saw the car parked beside my truck. Silver, gleaming. The kind of vehicle that had no business being anywhere near a hole in the ground. A woman stood beside it. She was maybe 45, dressed in clothes that cost more than everything I owned combined. Her suit was dark gray, perfectly tailored. Her shoes had heels that sank slightly into the soft earth, and she shifted her weight with visible annoyance at the inconvenience. Her hair was styled in a way that suggested professional attention, and her nails were painted a deep red that looked like dried blood in the afternoon light. She looked at me like I was an obstacle, something to be assessed, evaluated, and ultimately removed. "You must be the girl," she said. Her voice was smooth, controlled. The voice of someone accustomed to getting what she wanted. "I'm the owner," I corrected. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Nothing about her reached her eyes. They stayed flat and calculating, measuring me the way of a predator measures prey. My name is Bellamy Vance. I'm a real estate investor from Billings. I heard you purchased this property at auction. I didn't respond, just waited. She stepped closer, her heels finding more solid ground. Her perfume reached me before she did something expensive and floral that seemed entirely wrong for this place of dirt and stone and honest work. I'd like to make you an offer, she said. $500, cash, right now. She reached into her jacket and pulled out an envelope, held it up so I could see the bills inside. 5 crisp $100 bills. More money than I had seen in months. The property isn't for sale. Her smile flickered. Just for a moment, something cold and hard showed through the polished exterior. Then it was gone, replaced by professional courtesy. Everything's for sale at the right price, she said. She tilted her head, studying me like a scientist examining a specimen. You're young, clearly resourceful, but this land has complications you probably don't know about. Legal issues, zoning problems. I'm offering you a way out before you get in over your head. I looked at her, at the expensive car, at the perfect suit, at the confident smile, at the way she held herself like someone who was used to getting what she wanted, who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. The property isn't for sale, I said again. Her eyes narrowed. The mask slipped a little further, and I caught a glimpse of the real Bellamy Vance, the one who didn't smile when no one was watching, the one who saw people as problems to be solved rather than human beings. Think about it, she said. Her voice had lost some of its smoothness. You're living in a hole in the ground. You have no money, no resources, no future. I'm offering you a fresh start, a chance to walk away with something instead of nothing. She held out the envelope again like $500 could buy a life. I didn't take it. I've already started, I said, and I'm not walking away. Something shifted in her expression. The professional mask dropped entirely, and for just a moment I saw what lay beneath. Anger, frustration, the cold fury of someone who wasn't used to being refused. You'll regret this decision, she said. Her voice was quiet now, almost soft. But there was nothing soft about the words. This land has complications, legality, logistics, things you can't even imagine. I was trying to help you avoid them. She turned and walked back to her car, her heels stabbing the ground with each step. She opened the door and paused, looking back at me one final time. I'll be in touch, she said, when you're ready to be reasonable. She drove away, and I watched her car disappear down the gravel road, trailing dust behind it like a warning. I knew with cold certainty that she would be back. Sheriff Waylon Mercer arrived 3 days later. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and deliberate in his movements, with a weathered face that spoke of years spent under open skies. He wore his authority like a comfortable coat, something he had grown into over decades of practice. When he looked at the excavation site, his face was carefully neutral. Miss Whitmore, he said, I received a complaint about what? He pulled a small notebook from his shirt pocket. Unauthorized construction, possible code violations, concerns about structural safety. I felt cold despite the October sun. Who filed the complaint? He looked at me steadily, his eyes revealing nothing. Does it matter? It matters if someone is trying to take my property. He was quiet for a long moment. Something passed across his face, a flicker of something that might have been sympathy or might have been understanding. I'm not here to take anything, he said finally. He closed the notebook. I'm here to assess the situation. Can you show me what you're building? I led him down into the excavation, showed him the reinforced walls, the support beams, the drainage trenches I had dug around the perimeter. Explained the ventilation system, the thermal mass principles, the way I had preserved the original stonework while adding modern structural support. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he stood in the main chamber, turning in a slow circle. His eyes took in every detail, the careful joinery, the solid foundation, the evidence of work done right. You built all this yourself, he asked finally. Mostly, I said. I've had some help with materials, but the work is mine, he nodded slowly. That's more than most people could do. Am I in violation of anything? He sighed. The sound was heavy with bureaucracy and the weight of rules that didn't always make sense. Technically, he said, you need permits for this kind of construction. But this property has been classified as agricultural land since 1892. The original structure predates most of our current regulations, and what you're doing appears to be restoration rather than new construction. What does that mean for me? It means I'm going to recommend that this be classified as historic restoration rather than new building. He looked at me directly, but I'm going to need documentation. Evidence that the original structure existed, proof that you're preserving rather than creating. I'll get it. He nodded. You've got 30 days. After that, I'll need to make a decision one way or the other. He started climbing back toward the surface, then paused with one hand on the stone archway. The light from above framed him in a rectangle of pale sky. Miss Whitmore, he said. Yes, Bellamy Vance is not a woman who gives up easily. Whatever she wants with this property, she'll try other ways to get it. He paused. Be careful. He climbed out and walked back to his truck. I watched him drive away and stood there for a long moment processing what had just happened. Someone had filed a complaint. Someone wanted me gone. And I had 30 days to prove that I had a right to stay. The library became my second home. Every afternoon after a morning of construction work, I would drive into town and disappear into the stacks. The building was old, built in the 1920s, with high ceilings and tall windows that let in the pale autumn light. The floors creaked when you walked on them, and the air smelled like old paper and dust and the particular mustiness of accumulated knowledge. Mrs. Calloway, the librarian, was a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a beaded chain and a memory like a steel trap. She had been running this library for 30 years, and there wasn't a document in the county records that she couldn't find. She watched me with curious eyes as I worked. Day after day, I sat at the same table surrounded by books on Montana land, law agricultural exemptions, historic preservation codes. I took notes in a spiral notebook that grew fat with information, filling page after page with statutes and precedents in the particular language of legal protection. You're researching something specific, Miss Calloway said one afternoon, setting a cup of coffee beside my elbow. I looked up from the book I was reading. Property law, I said. Agricultural structures, historic preservation. She nodded slowly, her eyes sharp behind those reading glasses. This wouldn't have anything to do with the Vance woman, would it? I felt my spine stiffen. You know her. Everyone in this county knows Bellamy Vance. She sat down across from me, lowering her voice even though we were alone in the reference section. She bought the Thornton farm 3 years ago, Mrs. Calloway said. Told them it was worthless, that the soil was depleted, the water rights were questionable, that they'd never get a better offer. They were elderly, the Thorntons. Mr. Thornton was sick. They needed the money for medical bills. So they sold, for a fraction of what the land was worth. She paused and something dark crossed her face. 6 months later, Bellamy Vance resold that property to a mining company for 10 times what she paid. Mining, I said. Mineral rights. Mrs. Calloway tapped the table with one finger, her nail clicking against the wood. This whole region sits on a vein of rare earth minerals, she said. The big companies have been buying up land for years, but they prefer to work through intermediaries. People like Bellamy Vance. People who know how to pressure vulnerable sellers into giving up their property for nothing. My stomach went cold. And my property, I asked, though I already knew the answer. Mrs. Calloway's eyes met mine. I don't know for certain, she said, but I know that woman doesn't chase worthless holes in the ground. If she wants your land, there's a reason. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bed in the main chamber staring up at the ceiling I had built with my own hands. The wood stove crackled softly in the corner, and the familiar smells of earth and stone surrounded me. But my mind was racing, turning over the pieces of a puzzle I was only beginning to understand. Bellamy Vance, $500. Mineral rights. I thought about the Thornton family, whoever they were. Elderly, vulnerable, pressured into selling their land for nothing only to watch it resold for a fortune. I thought about how easy it would be for someone like Bellamy Vance to do the same thing to me. I was 17, I was alone, I was living in a hole in the ground with nothing but determination and stubbornness to protect me. But I was not going to be pressured. I was not going to be vulnerable. I was going to find out exactly what was under my land and exactly how to protect it. For 3 nights straight, I barely slept. I sat in the library until closing time, then continued in my truck by flashlight, reading through Montana property codes, agricultural exemptions, historic preservation statutes. My eyes burned. My head ached, but I kept going. On the fourth night, I found it. Section 47-2-201 of the Montana Historic Preservation Act. The words seemed to glow on the page, illuminated by my flashlight beam in the darkness of my truck. Structures built before 1900 on agricultural land that demonstrate continuous use or restoration intent may qualify for expedited heritage classification. Continuous use or restoration intent. I had been restoring in that cellar since the day I bought it. Every beam I installed, every wall I reinforced, every improvement I made was documented in my notebook. Dated, detailed, photographed with the old camera I had bought at a yard sale for $3. I had evidence, and more importantly, I had the law on my side. But I needed more. I needed proof that the original structure had existed in 1892. I needed documentation that what I was doing was restoration, not new construction. I needed to find the records. Shep helped me search. The county records office was in the basement of the courthouse, a dusty warren of filing cabinets and cardboard boxes that seemed to have been organized by someone who believed in chaos theory. We spent hours digging through archived documents, our fingers black with dust, our eyes strained from reading faded handwriting. Land surveys from the 1890s. Construction permits from before anyone thought to require permits. Photographs of homesteads long since crumbled to dust. And then in a manila folder that hadn't been opened in decades, we found it. A survey map dated 1892. The paper was fragile, yellowed with age, and I held it with trembling hands. The ink had faded to a pale brown, but the words were still legible. Root Cellar Stone Construction, J. Harris Property, Parcel 14. So I stared at the paper. Proof that the structure had existed. Proof that what I was doing was restoration, not creation. Proof that I had a right to be there. Shep looked over my shoulder, his breath warm against my ear. "That's it," he said. "That's what you needed." I carefully slipped the document into a protective sleeve I had brought for exactly this purpose. "Not quite," I said. "There's still one more thing I need to know. What's that? What's really under my land?" The answer came 3 days later. I had been doing research at the library, following a trail of breadcrumbs through geological surveys and mining records. Mrs. Calloway had helped pulling files from the State Geological Archive that showed mineral deposits throughout the region. And there on a map dated 1987, I found it. A rare earth mineral deposit running directly beneath my property. Estimated value $2 million. I sat back in my chair, the breath leaving my lungs in a rush. $2 million. Bellamy Vance had offered me $500 for land worth $2 million. $500 for a life. I thought about the Thornton family again, about how they had been pressured into selling for a fraction of what their land was worth, about how Bellamy Vance had made millions by exploiting people who didn't know what they had. She wasn't going to do that to me. I wasn't going to let her. I filed my documentation with the county clerk the next morning. The 1892 survey map, my photographs documenting the restoration work, my application for expedited heritage classification under Section 47-2-201 of the Montana Historic Preservation Act. The clerk, a tired woman with reading glasses and a perpetual frown, looked at the stack of papers with something like surprise. This is thorough, she said, flipping through the pages. Most people don't even know these statutes exist. I did my research, I said. She stamped the papers and handed me a receipt. This will go to the review board, she said. They meet once a month. Given the circumstances, I'll recommend expedited review. You should have an answer within 2 weeks. And in the meantime, she looked at me over the top of her glasses. In the meantime, she said, no one can touch that property. It's officially under heritage review. I walked out of the courthouse with the receipt in my pocket and the sun on my face. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. October faded into November and the world began to change. The temperature dropped slowly at first, then with increasing conviction. Frost painted the mornings white and ice began to form on the edges of the creek. The grass on my property turned brown and brittle, and the wind carried a bite that warned of the winter to come. I worked through it all, finishing the third chamber, installing the wood stove properly with fire brick lining and a proper chimney that drew the smoke upward and outward, building shelves for storage, stockpiling firewood against the south-facing side of the mound where it would stay dry and accessible. Shep came when he could, helping with the heavy work. We talk more now about things beyond construction and materials, about our pasts and our futures and the dreams we carried like fragile things that might break if we held them too tightly. I learned that he wanted to build houses, real houses, the kind that families grew up in and grew old in, the kind that held memories like treasures. I learned that he had been saving money for years, penny by penny, dreaming of the day he could start his own construction company. I learned that he saw something in me that he couldn't quite name, but couldn't quite ignore either. We didn't talk about what that meant. Not yet. Some things need time to grow, like seeds planted in darkness, waiting for the right moment to push toward the light. The notice came on November 10th. A letter from the Montana Historic Preservation Office delivered by Sheriff Mercer himself. He handed it to me with a strange expression on his face, something between professional neutrality and personal satisfaction. Thought you'd want to see this right away, he said. I opened the envelope with hands that were steadier than I expected. The letter was brief official, typed on state letterhead. Dear Miss Whitmore, after reviewing your application for heritage classification under Section 47-2-201, the Montana Historic Preservation Office is pleased to inform you that your property parcel 14C has been granted expedited heritage status. This classification recognizes the historical significance of the stone root cellar constructed in 1892, as well as your documented restoration efforts. As a heritage site, your property is now protected under state law. Any attempt to alter, acquire, or develop the property without your explicit consent constitutes a violation of Montana heritage protection statutes and is subject to criminal prosecution. Congratulations on preserving this piece of Montana history. I read the letter twice. Then I read it again. Congratulations, Sheriff Mercer said. You did it. I looked up at something in my chest felt like it was breaking and mending at the same time. She can't touch it, I asked. My voice came out strange, thin. Bellamy Vance. She can't take it. He shook his head. That property is protected now, he said, legally, permanently. No one can take it from you. I stood there in the cold November air, holding a piece of paper that weighed almost nothing but meant everything. I had done it. I had fought, and I had won. And somewhere in the distance, the wind was picking up, carrying the first whispers of the winter to come. The radio started talking about the storm on November 12th. Arctic front, the announcer said, his voice crackling through the static. Moving down from Canada, heavy snowfall expected. Accumulations of 2 to 3 feet in some areas. High winds, dangerous wind chill. Residents are advised to prepare for potential multi-day power outages. I stood in the main chamber of my shelter, listening to the warning. This could be the worst winter storm in a decade, the announcer continued. Please take all necessary precautions. I looked around at what I had built. 3 chambers, reinforced and insulated. A wood stove with a proper chimney, Ventilation shafts that would keep the air fresh even when snow buried everything above. 3 weeks of food stored in the back room. Water barrels filled from the spring, firewood stacked and dry. I had been preparing for winter since September. I hadn't known that winter would come like this. Shep arrived that evening at his truck loaded with supplies he had gathered from the store. Generator parts, he said, unloading boxes, extra batteries, canned food. My uncle thinks everyone's overreacting, but I wanted to make sure you had everything you needed. We stood together at the entrance of the shelter, watching the sky. It had that strange, heavy quality that precedes a major storm. The clouds were thick and gray, moving fast from the north. The air tasted like metal. "It's coming," Shep said quietly. "I know. Are you scared?" I thought about the question. Really thought about it. "No," I said finally. "I'm ready." He turned to look at me, and there was something in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. "I'll stay," he said, "if you want me to. I don't want you to be alone when it hits." I looked at him. This boy who had wandered into my life with scrap lumber and quiet kindness. This boy who had helped me build something without asking for anything in return. This boy who saw a hole in the ground and called it impressive. "Okay," I said. He smiled. And somewhere to the north, the storm began to move. The storm didn't arrive all at once. It built itself over 3 days like a living thing, growing stronger with each passing hour. The wind came first, screaming down from the Canadian border, with a voice like grief, bending fence posts sideways and tearing the last dead leaves from the cottonwood trees. The sound was relentless, a constant howl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then came the ice. It coated everything in a crystalline shell that made the world beautiful and treacherous. The grass became glass. The trees became sculptures. Every surface gleamed with a deadly shine that caught the pale light and threw it back in fractured rainbows. Branches snapped under the weight, falling without warning, turning ordinary trees into glittering daggers that crashed to earth with sounds like gunshots. Then came the snow. It fell thick and silent, burying the landscape under a white shroud that swallowed roads and fences and any trace of the world I had known. The flakes were fat and heavy, accumulating faster than seemed possible, erasing the boundaries between earth and sky until everything was just white. Endless, suffocating white. By the second night, the power grid had failed. I heard about it on my battery-powered radio, huddled in the main chamber, with Shep beside me and the wood stove crackling in the corner. The announcer's voice was strained, trying to maintain calm while delivering news that was anything but. "Transmission lines down across most of the county," he said. "Ice accumulation on towers has caused multiple failures. Montana Power reports restoration timeline is uncertain. Emergency shelters are open at the high school gymnasium and the community center. Residents without heat are urged to seek shelter immediately." I looked at Shep. His face was lit by the orange glow of the stove shadows dancing across his features. "How bad do you think it is?" he asked. "Bad," I said. "Bad enough that people are going to die." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with truth neither of us wanted to acknowledge. Above us, the wind screamed. But down here in the shelter I had built with my own hands, the temperature held steady at 55 degrees. The first family started arriving on day 3. I heard the knock from underground, a distant thumping that seemed to come from another world. I climbed up through the entrance and found them standing in the snow. A young couple with 2 children, their faces red with cold and their eyes desperate with fear. "Please," the woman said. Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Our furnace died. The pipes froze. We have nowhere else to go." I looked at them. At the children, a boy maybe 6 years old and a girl not more than 4. They were bundled in every piece of clothing their parents could find, but still they shivered, their small bodies trembling against the cold that was trying to kill them. "Come in," I said. They descended into the shelter like refugees entering a promised land. The warmth hit them immediately, and I watched their faces transform. The tension in their shoulders eased. The fear in their eyes faded. The children stopped shivering. "It's warm," the woman whispered. She looked around at the stone walls, at the wood stove, at the space I had carved from the earth. "It's actually warm. Thermal mass," I said. "The earth holds the heat." She started to cry. Her husband put his arm around her, and the children pressed close, and they stood there in my shelter. This family I had never met, weeping with relief because they had found a place where the cold couldn't reach them. I gave them blankets and hot tea in a corner of the main chamber where they could rest. And I wondered how many more would come. Day 4, the radio reported that 2 elderly residents had been found dead in their homes, frozen in their beds when their heat failed. Trees were snapping under the weight of ice. Roofs were groaning under the burden of snow. The emergency shelter at the high school was overcrowded, struggling to keep everyone warm. More people came to my door. A single mother with a baby wrapped in a blanket. An elderly man who could barely walk supported by his middle-aged son. 3 college students who had been driving home for Thanksgiving when their car slid off the road. I let them all in. The shelter wasn't designed for this many people. The main chamber was meant for 1, maybe 2, but I made it work. I organized shifts, rotating people in and out so everyone had time in the warmest spots near the stove. I managed the ventilation, opening the intake vent wider to accommodate the additional carbon dioxide from more bodies. I rationed the food, stretching 3 weeks of supplies to feed a dozen people. Shep helped. He coordinated the logistics, keeping track of who was where and who needed what. He kept the fire fed, hauling wood from the stockpile I had built against the south wall. He talked to the children, telling them stories to keep them calm while the wind howled above us. At night, when the others were sleeping, we would sit by the stove and talk in whispers. "You're amazing," he said one night. His voice was soft, barely audible above the crackle of the flames. "You know that, right? What you're doing here. It's amazing. I'm just doing what needs to be done." "No," he shook his head. "You built this. You saw a hole in the ground and you turned it into something that's saving lives. That's not just doing what needs to be done. That's something more." I didn't know what to say to that. So I just sat there watching the flames dance, feeling the warmth of the fire and the warmth of his presence beside me. Some things don't need words. They just are. Day 5. The knock came just after noon. I was underground adjusting the damper on the stove when I heard it. Not the desperate pounding of refugees seeking shelter, but something slower, hesitant, almost reluctant. I climbed up through the entrance and stopped. Emmett Sutner stood in the snow. He was hunched against the cold, wrapped in a thick coat that couldn't quite hide how small he had become. Snow clung to his eyebrows and the gray stubble on his chin. His breath came in short, visible puffs, and his hands were shaking, whether from cold or from something else I couldn't tell. But his eyes were different than they had been at the auction. The judgment was gone. The dismissal was, the certainty that I would fail, that I would bury myself, that young people couldn't do anything right, all of it was gone. In its place was something raw, something desperate, something broken. "My furnace died," he said. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Gas line froze solid. We tried space heaters, but the power's been out since Tuesday." He stopped. I watched him struggle with the words, watched him fight against whatever was holding them back. "My wife," he said finally. "Odalis. Her heart. The cold is too much. She can't take it." His voice cracked on the last word. And I understood. This man who had stood at an auction and watched me buy a hole in the ground. This man who had told his friend that I was going to bury myself. This man who had looked at me with disappointment and derision, certain that I would fail, like all young people fail. He was standing at my door begging for help. I thought about all the things I could say, all the ways I could remind him of his words, all the satisfaction I could take in this moment of vindication. But Odalis had brought me casserole when no one else would look at me. She had told me about her daughter, about Rosemary, about the grief that had turned her husband into a shell of the man he used to be. She had looked at me with kindness when the rest of the world saw only a foolish girl with a hole in the ground. I stepped aside. "Come in," I said. Emmett stared at me. For a long moment, he didn't move. Just stood there in the snow looking at me like he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. Like he had prepared himself for rejection and didn't know what to do with acceptance. Then he moved forward, stepping through the stone archway into the warm glow of the shelter below. He stopped just inside the entrance. The main chamber stretched before him, larger than it looked from outside. Stone walls reinforced with lumber, plywood panels painted white, the wood stove radiating heat in gentle waves. People huddled in corners, wrapped in blankets, their faces turned toward the warmth. He turned in a slow circle, taking it all in, and then he started to cry. Silent tears running down his weathered face, disappearing into the stubble on his chin. His shoulders shook and his hands came up to cover his eyes, and he stood there in my shelter. This proud man, this stubborn man, weeping like a child. "You built this," he said. His voice was broken, barely recognizable. "You actually built this." "Yes." He looked at me. "I said you were digging your own grave. I know. I told everyone you were going to fail. I know." He was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled, the wind howled above us. The other refugees watched in silence, sensing that something important was happening. "I was wrong," he said finally. "I was so wrong." I looked at this man who had carried grief like a weight for years, who had lost his daughter and never recovered, who had looked at young people and seen only reminders of what he had lost. "You weren't wrong," I said. "You were scared." He flinched like I had struck him. "After we lost Rosemary," he said slowly, "I stopped believing in anything, in anyone. I told myself that dreams were foolish, that young people would always fail, that hope was just another word for disappointment. Because if I didn't hope, I couldn't be hurt again." He met my eyes. "But you hoped," he said. "You saw a hole in the ground and you hoped it could be something more. And you were right." I reached out and took his hand. His fingers were cold rough with calluses trembling slightly. "Go get your wife," I said. "Bring blankets, if you have them. We'll figure out the rest." He nodded, squeezed my hand. "Thank you," he whispered. Then he was gone, climbing up through the entrance, disappearing into the snow to retrieve the woman who had shown me kindness when I needed it most. They came back an hour later. Odalis was bundled in so many layers she looked twice her normal size. A cocoon of woolen, down that still couldn't hide how frail she had become. Emmett carried her through the entrance like she weighed nothing, though I could see the strain in his arms, the fear in his eyes every time she winced. We settled her near the stove, propped up on pillows, wrapped in every blanket I could spare. I heated water and made her tea weak and warm, the way she had probably made it for countless others over the years. Slowly, the color returned to her cheeks. "It's warm," she whispered, looking around with wonder. Her eyes found mine and she smiled, and even weak and exhausted, that smile was full of warmth. "You did it, Jess. You actually did it." "I did it." I agreed. She reached out and took my hand. Her fingers were thin, papery, but her grip was stronger than I expected. "I knew you would," she said, "from the first time I saw you covered in dirt and determination. I knew you would build something beautiful." The others made room for them. This elderly couple who had lived in this county their whole lives. This man who had been broken by grief and this woman who had kept hoping anyway. They became part of our underground community, sharing space and warmth and the particular intimacy that comes from surviving something together. And Emmett, this man who had told everyone I would fail, became the most dedicated helper of all. He managed the wood supply, hauling logs from the stockpile with a strength that belied his 63 years. He organized the sleeping arrangements, making sure everyone had enough blankets. He told stories to the children, old tales from Montana's history that kept them entertained during the long hours underground. And every time he looked at me, there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Respect. Day 8, the word had spread. I don't know how. In a world without power or phones, news still traveled. Maybe it was people who had warmed themselves in my shelter and then returned to their cold homes telling their neighbors about the underground refuge that actually worked. Maybe it was the simple mathematics of survival, word passing from person to person until everyone knew. The girl with the hole saved them. The underground shelter works. Go to parcel 14, see if you need help. More families came. The Thorntons arrived on day 8, and when I saw them, I understood something I hadn't before. Tom Thornton was a tired man in his 50s with calloused hands and defeated eyes. His wife Marie was small and quiet, the kind of woman who had learned to take up as little space as possible. Their 3 children huddled behind them, the youngest barely 5 years old, her lips tinged blue at the edges. "We heard about this place," Tom said. His voice was rough with embarrassment. "Heard a girl built something that actually works." I recognized the name. Thornton. The family that Bellamy Vance had cheated 3 years ago. The family that had sold their farm for a fraction of its worth because a woman in an expensive suit had told them lies about their own land. I looked at their children, at the 5-year-old with blue lips, at the fear in their eyes. "Come in," I said. They descended into the warmth and the children fell asleep on the floor near the stove, their small bodies finally relaxing after days of cold and fear. Marie wept silently, her hand pressed to her mouth. Tom stood in the center of the chamber, looking around at the walls, at the ceiling, at the evidence of work done right. Before they left, he pulled me aside. "I know who you are," he said quietly. His eyes were intense, burning with something that might have been shame or might have been hope. "You're the one Bellamy Vance was trying to cheat, the one who wouldn't sell." I nodded. "She told us our land was worthless too," he said. "We believed her. We had no reason not to. And then she sold it to the mining company for 10 times what she paid us." "I'm sorry," I said. He shook his head. "Don't be sorry," he said. "Be proud. You're the one who stopped her. You're the one who said no." He extended his hand. I shook it. "If you ever need anything," he said, "you come to us. We owe you." I looked at this man who had lost his land, his legacy, his children's inheritance, who had been cheated by someone with more power and fewer scruples, who had spent 3 years living with that shame. "You don't owe me anything," I said. "Just take care of your family." His eyes glistened. He nodded once sharply and turned away before I could see him cry. Day 12 had come. The storm was beginning to weaken. The wind still howled, but with less conviction now. The snow still fell, but lighter, almost half-hearted. The world above was buried under 3 feet of white, but the worst was over. I was underground checking on Odalis when I heard the engine. Not a car engine, something smaller, higher pitched. A snowmobile. I climbed up through the entrance and saw Sheriff Waylon Mercer dismounting from the machine. His face was red from the wind and the cold, his uniform hidden beneath layers of winter gear. He walked toward me slowly, his boots crunching through the snow. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Sheriff." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. His hands were steady, but there was something in his eyes. Something that looked almost like satisfaction. "I have news," he said, "about Bellamy Vance." I felt my stomach tighten. "What kind of news?" He unfolded the paper and handed it to me. "We executed a search warrant on her office yesterday," he said. "Found documentation of 6 other properties she's acquired through similar tactics in the past 5 years. Forged appraisals, falsified environmental reports, intimidation of elderly landowners who didn't know what their land was really worth." I read the paper. Official seals, signatures. Her name printed in stark black letters next to words like fraud and coercion and theft by deception. "This is a formal notification," the sheriff continued, "that the state attorney general's office has opened an investigation. Bellamy Vance was arrested this morning in Billings." I looked up from the paper. "Arrested," I repeated. He nodded. "She's facing 12 counts of real estate fraud," he said, 3 counts of elder abuse, and 1 count of attempted theft by deception. His eyes met mine. That last one is for you, he said, for what she tried to do with your property. I stood there in the snow, holding the paper in my hands. The land she wanted, I said slowly. How much was it really worth? The sheriff's expression didn't change. About $2 million, he said, according to preliminary geological surveys, rare earth minerals. She would have paid you 500 and sold it for 2 million. I thought about that first day she had appeared. The expensive car, the confident smile, the way she had looked at me like I was nothing. She underestimated you, the sheriff said. They all did. I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into my pocket. No, I said. They just couldn't see what I was building. The sheriff nodded. I'm going to recommend that your property be officially designated as a historic site, he said. The 1892 survey you found combined with your restoration work, it qualifies. Full protection under state and federal law. No one's going to be able to touch that land, ever. He climbed back onto his snowmobile and started the engine. Miss Whitmore, he said, raising his voice to be heard above the motor. Yes, when this is over, you should think about teaching what you know, about construction, about working with the land instead of against it. He paused. People could learn from you. He didn't wait for an answer, just nodded once and drove away, disappearing into the white landscape. I stood there for a long moment watching him go. Then I climbed back down into my shelter, where the warmth waited, where the people I had saved were sleeping peacefully, where the foundation I had built held firm against everything the world could throw at it. Day 17. The power came back on. I didn't notice at first. I was underground where there had never been electricity anyway, where warmth came from fire and earth, rather than wires and circuits. But Shep went up to check on conditions and came back down with a strange expression on his face. It's over, he said. The storm, the crisis, lights are coming on all over town. I looked around the chamber, at the walls I had built with my own hands, at the stove that had kept so many people warm, at the refugees who had become over 17 days of shared survival, something like family. No, I said, it's just beginning. They came to say thank you. One by one over the following days as the roads were cleared and the world returned to something like normal. The families who had warmed themselves in my shelter, the neighbors who had doubted me, people I had never met who had only heard the story secondhand. The girl bought a hole for $12. She turned it into a shelter. She saved half the neighborhood when the power went out. Tom Thornton came with his wife and children, bringing a handmade quilt that Marie had been working on for months. The young couple from day 3 returned with a basket of food and tears in their eyes. The elderly man and his son came back with firewood to replace what I had burned. And Emmett Sutner. Emmett came every day. He helped me clean up from the storm. He repaired the damage the wind had done to my entrance. He split wood and stacked it neatly against the south wall, preparing for the rest of the winter. One afternoon, when the sun was actually shining and the snow was beginning to melt, he found me sitting at the entrance of my shelter, looking out over the valley. He sat down beside me. For a long time, neither of us spoke. I was wrong about you, he said finally. His voice was quiet, rough with emotion. I was wrong about everything. I know. He turned to look at me. After we lost Rosie, he said I stopped believing that young people could do anything. I looked at them, and all I could see was her. All I could feel was the fear of losing again. So I told myself they would fail, that their dreams were foolish, that hope was a trap. He paused. But you hoped anyway, he continued. You saw a hole in the ground, and you hoped it could be something more. And you were right. I was stubborn, I said. That's not the same as hoping. He almost smiled. Maybe not, but it takes hope to be stubborn. It takes believing that what you're doing matters. That if you just keep going, keep working, keep building, something good will come of it. He reached out and put his hand on my shoulder. You showed me that, he said. Every day you worked on this place. Every wall you reinforced. every beam you set. You showed me that hope isn't foolish, that sometimes the impossible things actually happen. I felt tears prick at my eyes. Odalis told me about Rosie, I said. About what happened. I'm sorry. He nodded slowly. She would have liked you, he said. Rosie, she had that same fire, that same stubbornness. He paused. She never got to build what she dreamed of building. But you did. And somehow that helps. We sat there together as the sun began to set, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For not turning us away. For opening your door when you had every reason to slam it shut. For being better than I deserved. I thought about all the times I had wanted to give up. All the nights I had lain in my truck wondering if I was fooling myself. All the moments when the hole in the ground had seemed like nothing more than a grub waiting to swallow me. I thought about my father, about the last time I saw him. See you tonight, Ladybug. You weren't wrong to be scared, I said finally. Fear makes sense when you've lost someone, but closing yourself off doesn't bring them back. It just means you lose the chance to love anyone else. Emmett was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded. I know, he said. I'm starting to know. Spring came slowly to Montana that year. The snow melted in fits and starts, revealing brown grass and muddy roads and a landscape that looked wounded but alive. Crocuses pushed through the soil, then daffodils, then the first tentative leaves on the cottonwood trees. Odalis helped me plant a garden. We worked together on the south-facing slope, turning the soil with shovels and rakes, planting seeds in careful rows. Tomatoes, beans, squash, herbs that would fill the summer air with their fragrance. She told me stories while we worked. About Rosie as a baby, how she had laughed at everything. About Rosie as a child, how she had collected rocks and leaves and anything else she could find. About Rosie as a teenager, full of dreams and plans and the certainty that she could do anything. I told her stories too, about my father, about the way he used to sing in the shower, about the blue paint on my bedroom walls, about the morning he left and never came back. We cried together sometimes, and we laughed together sometimes. And slowly through the simple act of planting things, we began to heal. Shep built a shed. It stood at the entrance to my shelter, a simple wooden structure that protected the stone archway from the weather. He used lumber he had salvaged from job sites, fitting the pieces together with the precision of someone who had been dreaming of building things his whole life. It took him 3 weeks. When he was finished, he stood back and looked at it with something like pride. It's not much, he said, just a shed. I looked at the careful joints, at the straight lines, at the evidence of work done right. It's a start, I said. He smiled. Yeah, he said. I guess it is. That night we sat together on the tailgate of my truck, looking up at the stars. The air was warm finally after months of cold. The crickets were singing in the darkness, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called out lonely and wild. What happens now? He asked. I thought about the question. I keep building, I said. I make this place better, stronger. I plant things, I grow things, I create something that lasts. And me, I turned to look at him. His face was half lit by the moonlight shadows pooling in the hollows of his cheeks. His eyes were dark and warm, and looking at me like I was something worth seeing. What do you want to happen? I asked. He was quiet for a long moment. I want to keep building too, he said finally. Not just sheds, not just other people's projects. I want to build something of my own, something that matters. He reached out and took my hand, and I want to do it with someone who understands what that means, he said. Someone who sees holes and imagines foundations, someone who doesn't give up. I looked at our hands, intertwined in the darkness. I could say something, I thought, something profound, something meaningful, something that captured everything I was feeling. But some things don't need words. I leaned against his shoulder, and we sat there together, watching the stars wheel overhead, planning futures that finally felt possible. One morning in late April, I stood at the entrance of the shelter I had built with my own hands, and watched the sun rise over the hills. The sky was painted in shades of pink and gold and pale blue, the same blue I had chosen for my bedroom walls when I was 8 years old. Blue like the sky had told my father, so I can fly even when I'm inside. Emmett was walking up the path carrying a basket of eggs from his hen house. He came every morning now, part of a routine we had developed without ever discussing it. Eggs for me, coffee for him, conversation for both of us. O'Dolly's was already in the garden, kneeling in the dirt, tending to the seedlings that were just beginning to push through the soil. She wore a wide-brimmed hat and gardening gloves, and she hummed as she worked a song I didn't recognize, but that sounded like happiness. Shep emerged from the shed, tools in hand, ready for another day of building. He was working on an expansion now, a workshop where he could store his equipment and plan his projects. The first step toward the construction company he had been dreaming of for years. And I stood at the entrance of my home, watching all of them, these people who had become my family. Morning, Emmett called out, raising the basket in greeting. Morning, I called back. He climbed up the slope and handed me the eggs. Fresh this morning, he said. Hens are laying better now that it's warm. Thank you. He nodded. Then he looked at me, really looked the way he had started doing after the storm. You did good, kid, he said. His voice was gruff, but there was warmth underneath it. Real good. I smiled. I know, I said. He laughed a real laugh, the first one I had ever heard from him. Now you sound like Rosie, he said. She always knew she was good too. He walked down to the garden to join his wife, and I watched them for a moment, this couple who had lost so much and were finally learning to hope again. Then I turned and looked out over the land. My land, the hole I had bought for $12, the foundation I had built with my own hands. I thought about my mother, about the morning she had let me walk away, about the silence in that kitchen, about the eggs burning in the pan while she stirred and refused to look at me. I didn't hate her anymore. I had hated her for a while, during those first nights in my truck, during the long weeks of work when my hands bled and my back ached and I wondered if I was fooling myself. I had hated her for not fighting, for not speaking, for choosing comfort over her own child. But hate takes energy, and I had needed all my energy for building. Now standing in the spring sunlight, I felt something else. Not forgiveness exactly, not understanding, but something quieter. Something that felt like letting go. She had made her choice. I had made mine. And my choice had led me here to this place, to these people, to this life that I had built from nothing but determination and $12. Shep walked up beside me, wiping his hands on his jeans. What are you thinking about, he asked. I took his hand. About holes, I said. The kind people see and the kind that are really there, he smiled. And what kind is this? I looked at the shelter, at the garden, at the shed, at Emmett and O'Dollis working together in the morning light. This isn't a hole, I said. This is a foundation. I had been digging for months, not just into the earth, but into myself, into the fear and the grief and the loneliness that had accumulated over years of loss, into the silence of a mother who couldn't love me and a stepfather who wouldn't try, into the emptiness left by a father who had promised to come home and never did. I had dug through all of it, and at the bottom, beneath all the rubble and the pain and the weight of everything I had lost, I had found something solid, something to build on, something real. Home isn't something you're given, it's something you build. One shovel at a time, one stone at a time, one day at a time, until the hole in the ground becomes a foundation, and the foundation becomes exactly where you were meant to be all along. The sun climbed higher over the hills. The garden grew green and full, and I stood at the entrance of my home, surrounded by the family I had chosen, looking out at a future that finally felt like it belonged to me. Everyone had seen a hole. I had seen a foundation. I just had to dig deep enough to find it.